Welcome to the Landlord Lease Podcast, a training course for landlords to understand how to create a lease. Sponsored by VeteranLandlord.com. And now your host, Edward O'Daniel.
Hey, landlords, welcome back to the Landlord Lease Podcast, sponsored by VeteranLandlord.com. My name is Edward O'Daniel. I'll be your host for the show. Hey, I want to welcome you back here to our second installment here of our landlord lease and our terms that we're defining here. On this particular episode, we're going to be going over a couple of terms, and these are all in alphabetical order. We're going to be covering death, default, early termination clause, or what people often call a buyout clause, what entire agreement clause means, eviction, good neighbor clause, governing law, and holding over or holdover. So we're going to be covering all of those on this episode of the Landlord Lease Podcast. First up is going to be death. This is not something that's very fun or easy to talk about, and it's going to be even worse if a tenant dies inside of your property. And how do you handle that? I tell you what, it was a bit freaky the first time it happened to me. First of all, I want to make sure that you guys know, obviously, if somebody dies, there's going to be a certain odor that people have. I'm just trying to prepare you as a landlord. But one of the things I was not aware of, at least at my first time this happened to me, was what they call death flies. So I just want to give you guys a heads up. If you haven't heard from your resident in a while and you think, maybe they could be old or elderly, if there are any windows, please go look at the windows first, and I'll explain why. Go look at the windows, specifically the bedroom windows. Typically, bedroom, the kitchen, or living room where people spend most of their time. But go look at some of the windows and look for flies. I know this is nasty, and I'm sorry to bring this up, but these are just the things that you need to include. I know this is a little bit outside of the death clause. I'll get to that in just a minute. But I'm trying to bring some real world value here to you as well. But look for flies, and these are going to be just nasty. They're called death flies. Big black type flies. They're really large, probably about 3 to 4 times the size of a regular fly that you would get. They are really large, and they're only present in the point of when somebody dies. So if you look for that, if you start seeing a bunch of flies on the window on the outside, I'm just giving you the heads up. That could be a good sign that somebody's dead inside. And you might want to think twice or have somebody called, like first responders, to come out and take a look at that and go in, because you do not want to be the first person through that door. I will guarantee you that. But back to the death clause and what this is. Basically, this is just going to be your procedure, or how you're going to handle in case the resident dies in this particular case. So you're going to have things on here as far as what you're allowed to do, what's going to happen to their belongings, who is going to be maybe the emergency contact for this, and how much time you're going to give that emergency contact person to respond before you take back control of your property. Keep in mind that whenever the resident that you have signed the lease and they die, that lease, that legal document, now becomes null and void. So anytime you have a legal document and somebody dies, that document dies with them. It's no longer enforceable. So right now, as a landlord, one of the things you want to think about is, how am I going to get this property reclaimed? How am I going to get back control of this property, get it fixed back up, and get it released? And at least that's what I would be thinking of here as a landlord. That's kind of what's on my mind. So the death is like, how do you handle all of their belongings, their contents? What are you going to do? So right now, it could be something as simple as, right now we're going to, upon your death, we will contact your emergency contact and give them 7 business days or 7 days to get all of the contents out of this particular property before we throw them away. Something like that, or how you're going to handle certain things inside of a particular property. So you can even have in there, what if the person, I know this is morbid and I hate to do this, it's never a good thing, but as a landlord, we have to deal with these things. What happens if they die owing you rent? Okay, who's going to be responsible for paying off the rent or any of the damages to the property? I mean, that's something that's legitimate. Right now, I know whenever I've had to deal with death in the past, just as an example, I've had somebody die and bleed all over a hardwood floor. Okay, so right now, one of the things you don't really understand is, because we're dealing in this kind of case with blood, that's a biochemical potentially contagion. You don't know what's in their blood. You don't know if it's infectious. You don't know. I mean, there's lots of things in there that you don't know about. So you have to kind of go above and beyond as a landlord. You just simply can't throw some bleach on it, wipe it up and clean it up, because that could potentially open you up for a lawsuit of who knows if that person had any kind of an infectious disease. And next thing you know, somebody turns that room into a nursery whenever they move their kids in there and the kids get sick or something like that. Now, I'm going worst case scenario on this one, guys. So I'm just trying to sit back and explain. And in this kind of case, we actually had to completely rip up the whole part of the hardwood floor that had the blood to really get rid of all of it, because it had seeped in between and it soaked into the wood and so forth. So we had to kind of get rid of it and pull up the whole floor and replace the flooring. My point I'm trying to make on that is that was thousands of dollars worth of labor, work, cleanup, and so forth. How are you going to get reimbursed for that? So are you going to allow potentially valuable content to be moved from the property if it can be sold and gone for, sold and used to pay off the expenses of that particular person passing? Check with your state on this, of how it processes this. But I mean, what happens if they have a big box of jewelry? I'm just saying. And are you going to allow the people to just come in, the family members come in and take all that stuff and say, okay, thank you. You can throw away the rest and get rid of it, which is going to cost you a lot of money. But now they got all the valuables and you're left with nothing. So, ultimately, there's going to have to be something inside of this as far as making you whole, making reparations for the damages that have happened or the money that's owed, maybe before they're allowed to take anything out of there. I know it seems morbid, and this is not really a greatest clause to talk about, and thinking that you're a good person, but these things need to be discussed, because ultimately, I know when I can't really think of the exact number here, but I'm thinking it's probably somewhere around $4,500 it took me to get the unit cleaned. Because of the smell was so bad, we had to bring in ozone machines. If you've ever had to do that to get the death smell out of there, it's just, that's just a smell that you can't get out of the air. You just don't get it out by, opening up the windows and airing it out. That kind of stuff, like smoke and nicotine, kind of gets into the walls. So anyway, that took a lot of money. And you just want to make sure that you understand you could recoup that money with the stuff that's in there. Or the person, if they want to get those belongings out, they have to make sure they pay for everything before they do. So just check with your state on that. That's something that can be quite complicated when it comes to death. But bottom line is, you need to be able to take quick, decisive action, and needs to be defined inside of here what you plan on doing, what's going to happen, so that the person moving in understands what's going to happen. Even though they're dead, they know that if something were to happen to them, this is what you're going to do. Now, the other thing that you need to look at here is your turnaround time. Speed is of the importance here when it comes to this. You can't sit back and hopefully you're not dealing with a crime scene here, because that's going to take a little bit more. I'm just talking about a natural death here, not like a break-in or a murder or something like that. That's a different story, because then it becomes a crime scene and you have to sit back and wait on the police to sit back and finish their investigation before that property can become yours again. And again, in that kind of case, it's just different in that kind of case. But what I'm trying to get to is how quickly you can turn your property around and get it re-rented. Because the longer that thing is off the market, the longer nobody is paying, the more money that you as a landlord are losing. So just make sure you put in there something along the lines of speed. Even once, if the family members do want to pay for the rent, and let's just say everything was good to go, and somebody died naturally in their bed, and everything was good, great. But you need to put a time limit on when they need to get that stuff out of there. So you can't just give them 30 days or let them come on the weekends and stuff like this, because this is a business for you. So I know that was a lot for death clause, but there's a lot to take in there, a lot to consider if it's never happened to you. Because if it happens to you the first time, I mean, that very first unit, my property was probably off the market 60 to 80 days. I mean, that's a lot. You're losing a couple of months worth of rent. That hurts, especially if you have a mortgage on that particular property. I mean, that hurts. So I'm here for you. I'm trying to help you understand that, this is something that you need to be able to understand what your course of action is and what to do in that scenario. Awesome. Okay, so moving on, we're going to cover default. So most leases have a default clause. And what a default clause really just defines is, what does it take for the resident to be in default. One of the common things where if you don't pay your rent on time, you're in default. So what does it mean to be in default? Being in default means that if you're in default, then this is the condition by which the landlord, management, however you want to phrase it, can then take other mechanisms or other means to get you to either to get back into compliance or non-default, or to even possibly evict you. So some things of default would be, I think in our leases, it's, if you don't pay the rent on time, if you or your any of your guests violate any of the other parts of the lease, like there's a rules and regulations part that we'll talk about on another episode. But if they violate any of those things, if they commit a crime, in your particular property here. So if it doesn't have to be the resident, it could be if the resident is a convicted felon, or somebody that committed a crime and somebody's holding out or living in your particular place, even though they committed a crime, you're harboring a fugitive. So that's committing a crime. So those type of things place you in default. And if you're in default, then you have the right to go through and take other means necessary to get these people removed from the property. So defaults are also come into play. I'm not sure if you do this as a landlord, but lease options. So if you do lease options, and that's a way to potentially even like a finance a property if you're looking to sell it. But if you do that, a lease option are two separate agreements. You have your lease, which is what we're going over here, but you also have your option agreement. So default could also mean that if you default on any other document relating to a particular property, meaning your option agreement, if you don't exercise your option, then you're in default of your lease, and in which case you need to move out. So default can mean a couple of different things depending on what you're doing to your property, but keep in mind default is just a way of indicating when somebody has violated the lease, and you either need to get them out of default by giving them some form of a letter that can say, hey, this is what you can do to get out of default, pay your rent, do this, maybe clean up trash around the property if they haven't been disposing of trash correctly, things like that. So if they do get out of default, great. Now they're not in default and they're normal again. So, but defaults are just a way of indicating, hey, you violated the lease in some way, shape, or form. And at that point, we can take other means to get you out. Now, early termination clause or buyout clause. I didn't have this thing in my lease for the longest, and I could literally kick myself for this because of how many people, I'm not sure if you've been in the business a while, but people sometimes move in and life happens. So people could lose their job, especially here over the last year or two with relating to COVID. Certain businesses shut down, they've lost their job, they're unable to sit back and continue with it. Some landlords I know, or our managers, owners, have actually just forgiven, allowed the people to just move out and not making payments. But what happens if it's like a job relocation? They move in, they signed a 12-month lease, and 4 months into the lease, oh, my job is transferring me out of state. I'm so sorry, I'm going to have to leave and break my lease. Well, okay, well, that's a possibility. There's an early lease or an early termination or buyout clause that is equal to a certain amount of money or a certain amount of months rent or something like that. But this could be very profitable for you as a landlord. If things get moved, especially if somebody doesn't want to have any kind of negative repercussions on their credit or any kind of legal trouble, they will sit back and buy you out of that particular lease. Now, I'll give you ours. We charge 3 months rent. So 3 months rent is what we charge if you want to close or terminate your lease early. And not only that, that's just the termination clause. There's other conditions that you have to return the property in. On another episode, we covered conditions of the property. So those conditions of the property have to be brought back to the condition that they moved into. So any repairs have to be made, cleanliness, things like that, all have to be done before you move out as well. And you still have to pay the early termination clause. So this is one of my favorite clauses at all. You could potentially make thousands more dollars with it. So, worst case scenario, you have to, the people move out, they leave it in good shape. You got an additional 3 months rent. You rent it in the next 30 days and you get a couple of months rent for free, with that. So just keep that in mind that with the early termination clause, please put something in there regarding that. Give them a way out, because if you don't give them a way out, It's going to happen. If people relocate their job, they're going to leave. They are, but they just want to make sure they do it equitably. And if you don't have something in your lease, then people feel like you're just making stuff up. And that becomes a problem with, getting people to pay 3 months rent. If they know that it's in their lease already, if they go read their lease and they find out their job is relocating them and they read, hey, early termination clause equal to 3 months rent. I knew about this when I moved in, then it's already well known. They'll pay it and you don't really have a problem. But if you don't put that in there, I have had that in there where you just owe me another month's rent or 2 months rent, and they feel like you're making stuff up. That's where you start having arguments and you're having to negotiate when you don't really need to, if you just have a clause like this in your lease. So again, I love this clause. It's made a lot of money for you. Entire agreement. So I didn't really too much understand this the very first time I had a lease. Like, what do you mean entire agreement? This doesn't make any sense to me. And that's because the first lease I had, it wasn't very well defined what this means. So typically right now in my lease is probably, say about 9 pages. I guess I should know, about 9 pages long, but I have about 7 or 8 addendums. Now, an addendum is something that we haven't gone into yet, but an addendum is really a lease clause that has gotten so large and complicated that it should be put on its own document. And one of the things that we'll talk about later is like a pet clause for pets. I have a separate addendum. I don't include pets in the actual lease document. That's a separate addendum. And we'll cover that in another episode, but that's something that's so large that encompasses several other things that I don't want to put that much information in the lease. I'd much rather have a separate document. And you might have several other addendums that you might add on to your lease. Well, the entire agreement area is where you simply define what the entire agreement is. So the entire agreement would consist of the lease document that you're signing in regards to addendum A, give them, or addendum 1, whatever you want to call it, and whatever that addendum is, addendum 2, addendum 3, or A, B, C, D, however you want to do this. But you list all of your addendums that go with it, and that pretty much makes the lease and all the addendums make the entire agreement for this. So I hope that makes sense. And this is where you would put that at. If you do have addendums, you would want to make sure that any other documents that are included with this lease are listed under the entire agreement area, because that way, if it ever goes to court and somebody ever looks at this, says, hey, the whole agreement includes these documents listed inside of your entire agreement lease area. So these right here all apply to your particular case. Now, I'm going to just, before we get into eviction, I missed one thing. I'm going to back up here about the early termination clause. Just real quick, it popped into my head. If you do have somebody that's using an early termination clause or moving out, make sure that you get a lease termination agreement. Okay, that's also, I believe there's one available for you at the veteranlandlord.com, but want to make sure that if they do move out, you need to have paperwork regarding everything as a landlord. So make sure that you download and get the lease termination agreement. What that means is that it's just an agreement that you and the resident sign. It says your lease originally set to expire December 31st of whatever year you're at, now hereby expires on whatever day that current person is moving out. That way it's pretty cut and dry, that you're not looking at potentially, because when that person moves out, you want to re-rent it, right, and release it. However, if you don't have a lease termination agreement, then the person that moved out may still have a valid lease while you're trying to re-rent it. And let's just say they came back in 60 days and said, hey, I've got a valid lease. I'm leasing this particular property. You released it. And now you have a problem where you're potentially leasing it to 2 people at the same time. You don't have that problem if you use a lease termination agreement, because that terminates on a particular day and then makes that unit available and terminates the rights of that particular resident as of that day. So that's very important. I want to make sure I didn't skip over and not give that to you here. So lease termination agreement, make sure if somebody moves out, even if it's early termination, or if you just want the person to leave, it doesn't really matter. Make sure you get a lease termination agreement, but that is a separate agreement other than a lease. But you will need that for your own, to sort of cover yourself, to make sure that you understand that they release all of their rights effective that day of the lease termination. And then moving forward, you gain control of the property. Awesome. Okay, next thing we're going to do is go over eviction. Basically, the eviction clause is very simple. It just means that we have to put you in eviction. Things like how much is the eviction going to cost you? What are you allowed to do or not allowed to do during eviction? Please check your state requirements for this, because at least in the state of Missouri, we're not allowed to accept money during an eviction. So that right there could actually invalidate the eviction. So you might file eviction, and if you're still continuing to pay, now it's different if somebody wants to pay their entire balance off, because they could pay the entire balance off and say, okay, I'm completely caught up now. We can cancel the eviction or satisfy it, however you want to do that. But you can't sit back and say somebody owes you $1,000, take $100 this week, $100 next week, because you're continuing to take money from them, even though you're evicting them. And if it goes to court, the judge may very well see that that's sort of sneaky and may invalidate your eviction, cancel it, and then you'd have to actually refile. So that could be a problem. So just check your state laws on that one and make sure that you stay in compliance. But here in the eviction, you just want to make sure that all of those things are clearly defined. Again, how much the eviction is going to cost, who's responsible for paying it, what the moving forward here, that you're not going to be able to accept payments, or payments have to go through your attorney, or whatever that looks like. But all of these things are going to be listed in the eviction area, just to make sure that it's very clear to them what the rules are whenever you put them into eviction. So moving on, the good neighbors clause. Again, it's not something technically. I saw this and just thought this would be a good thing to put into a lease. Basically, all it just says is that you're going to follow the rules of that community or area and be a good neighbor. What does being a good neighbor mean? It means not playing certain music within a certain time frame. Maybe it's 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. You're not going to have anything that's going to disturb, neighbors or something like that. Or it could be, handling trash correctly. It could be something as simply, believe it or not, as cooking. I know this sounds crazy, but if you're a landlord and you own a multifamily building, even something where people are in close proximity to each other here, if somebody's cooking something that's really raunchy or stinky, what do you think your other tenant, you think that smell is going to be contained inside of that person's apartment or home that's cooking it? No, that smell is going to permeate. It's going to go into the hallways. It's going to, potentially gross people out. And all that means is that you're going to sit back and have to start having to deal with all these calls from all the other residents in the building saying, hey, somebody's cooking this and it stinks. I don't need this kind of stuff here. Come get this and get this stuff figured out. And all that means is you have to now go and figure this stuff out and make sure that you can, get everybody happy again. So good neighbors clause could mean something as simple as you're not allowed to make certain types of foods that are smells. I know we've had residents that like to use incense. And I mean, incense, although, I know some of them smell good, they can permeate. That smell is not necessarily always appreciated by other people, especially if you live in a larger building or multifamily where you've got neighbors on top of you and to the side of you. So I'm just trying to help reduce your headache by putting things in your good neighbors clause. It's going to help you understand and reduce those amount of call volumes that you're going to get from your residents and the arguments that you're going to have to deal with. So all of the type of stuff goes inside of the good neighbor clause. Governing law. Right now, we always want to make sure that we have something in there just stating that regardless of what's happening in the lease, that the governing law, and this is something you can get from your attorney, or there's most likely going to be a governing law lease in all of the leases that for your state that just has some common verbiage that the common law of this state supersedes anything that's in this particular document. And it basically just means that you can't put something in the lease that violates local or the governing law of the area. Okay, that's all that means. So you just want to make sure that you have something in there that just simply says that you're going to comply with the governing law and that this rules over anything, even regardless of maybe what's in your lease. Now, our last one we're going to go over here on this episode is holding over here. So holding over just kind of means a little bit more about what happens at the end of a lease term, and holdover is, well, what happens to that? At the end of your lease term, are you allowed to go month to month? Does your lease terminate? Does your rent double? I'm just being kind of, these type of things are things that you have to sit back and understand what happens in the holdover. So these things all sit back and be defined in there. What are you going to allow? Some people don't allow to go month to month. So that could be up to you. So whether or not they go month to month, whether or not they're on holdover, they agree to sign a new lease, or their rent doubles, or their rent increases by a certain amount, or I've even seen, there's a monthly administration fee on the holdover if they go month to month. So all of these things happen on a holdover clause. Holdover just means what happens at the end of your lease term if you don't sign a new lease. So just think about that, what you're willing to do and what you're not willing to do. And just, again, all the things that we're talking about in this lease are meant to all work together. Once you've got all these lease terms defined in your lease, they're all really meant to make your job as a landlord easier and more simplified, because everything is defined in your lease. There's nothing left to chance. So a holdover clause is a good thing to sit back and just realize what it is. You could even just say no holdover required. We do not do month to month, that you would be in default of your lease if you do not sign another 12-month lease. That could be in your holdover clause as well, but at least it's defined of what happens once they go beyond that particular period in the lease. Hey, guys, thanks so much for joining us on this episode of the Landlord Lease Podcast. Again, I'm always happy that you guys signed in here. Please check out our next episode. We're going to be going over the next series of lease clauses, explaining what it is and how to make your job easier. But as always, thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you for listening to the Landlord Lease Podcast. To get your free lease and other training material, visit us at veteranlandlord.com and create your free account. If you find this material valuable, we'd appreciate it if you can share this podcast with others and leave us a great review.